Okay, here we go. Hello, friends. Welcome, welcome. Let us know in the chat where you're coming from today and if you are familiar with Hettie Judah and her amazing work, how you might know her. Hello, welcome. I am here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in the Midwest, and Hettie was just chatting about she might be making a trip to Indiana. So, we've got our Indiana connections happening here. Hello, welcome. All right, so I'm gonna dive right in here. If you are not a TTN member, I did share this link to just the broader web of Artist Mother community. We want to give a warm welcome to you. Thanks for being here. TTN is a virtual network of female identifying and non-binary artists. We do lots of amazing things and programming. We do an artist residency program. We do a weekly Zoom call. We do all sorts of fun stuff. And we would love to have you join us if you're interested. This talk is a part of the content of TTN. So we really value just kind of the idea of addressing the artist as a whole. We talk a lot about nourishing ourselves as artists. We give planning tools and career strategy, and then we do lots of community and connection. And our weekly art and tea sessions are Zoom calls that happen every Tuesday where we connect and share and just see what everybody's up to and talk about the joys and triumphs and tribulations and all the ups and downs of being an artist. So this talk, Hettie's talk, is our sponsored Q2 talk for the TTN programming. Last quarter, we had the lovely Danielle Crissa, who kind of whipped us into shape. We did a bit of art therapy talking about our inner critics, and it was awesome. And Hettie is an artist and curator, art writer, and she's going to share about her amazing show. And then our Q3 talk will be an artist and curator, Kimia Klein. And then our Q4 talk is textile and installation artist, Rachel Hayes. So be sure to join us. I also have really got connected with Hettie because of the work that I do for the Artist Mother community initially. So it's really great to have some crossover here today and have her on TTN. But I recorded an interview with Hettie back in, I guess we must have recorded in the summer of 2022, Hettie, because it was released in September. And if you want to go back and listen to that episode, it'll give you a lot more context on Hettie and kind of, you talk about like how you started as a writer and getting into art and those sorts of things. And we talk a lot about the amazing book that you wrote, How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents. So that's episode 135 on the Artist Mother podcast, if you want to check that out. Because today really Hettie is focusing on a large show that she curated and put together that is touring called Acts of Creation on Art and Motherhood. But I'm sure there'll be other context sprinkled in. And we will have a time of Q&A at the end. So feel free to, come up with some questions if there's some things that you'd like to be able to ask Hettie as we hear her talk today. All right, I'm ready to turn it over to you, friend, if you're ready.
Yes. Hello. And I'm very concerned about Katie not looking at the screen while she's driving.
Oh. Don't look at the screen, Katie. Listen, I am recording, so you'll get to go back and look at the awesome images.
And it was lovely to see Shweta's name pop up there somewhere as well. I can't see her on my screen, but lovely to connect with you again, Shweta. Always lovely to. Oh, I can see you now. Hi, Shweta. So I'm going to share my screen in a really inept and not very professional way. I can't see the button. Where is it? Am I allowed to share my screen? Have I been given that?
You're allowed. I know. I
Maybe
feel like from when you're not the host, it is suddenly so hard to figure out how to share your screen.
It's because it's the one that's highlighted in green. So obviously it's the
The one that you least would,
completely
yes.
evident thing. So yeah, of course I couldn't see it. Right, and I'm going to put this into.
Yay.
Right, that should almost look like I've got some kind of professional qualifications to present
It looks amazing.
Good. Well, it's good afternoon, everybody. It's nearly good evening here. So I thought I'd give you a bit of background about some of the work I've been doing over the last 5 years, because I don't know it. Also, I'm glad I did that, because it looked from the chat like some people kind of knew something about my work, but a lot of people were new to it. So in a broader sense, I'm a writer and a curator and an art critic. So I've written quite a few books. I don't just write about motherhood. That makes it sound like I'm reducing motherhood to something as if it's small, but I write about other things other than motherhood. But I'm going to really just chat briefly about why I started looking particularly at motherhood in the art world a few years ago, and where that journey's taken me over the last 5 years. And we will touch on the exhibition, and then I'll leave good time for questions, so that if there's stuff that you want to know more about that I didn't really touch on, then we can go into it more fully. So I'm always interested in things that make the art world uncomfortable, because generally if you product what makes the art world uncomfortable, it shows you something interesting about the art world and its prejudices. And quite a long time ago, I noticed that among the things that makes the art world very uncomfortable is motherhood, children, stuff about kind of death and illness as well. But I revisited this as an idea a few years ago, because there have been these fantastic reports that I'm sure all of you are aware of, looking at the gender balance in the art world and the representation of women. So in the US, you've had the Burns-Halperin report, which I'm sure lots of you have read, and it came up with all kinds of really depressing statistics like this: representation at US museums. I think it's 11% women, and of those, of the entire, that's only 2.2%, so 0.5% Black American women. So I mean, very bad statistics. They're looking at a general representation, and that's laying it out in terms of the relative to the population and the share of museum acquisition. So 50.5% of the population in the US is women. 11% of the art acquired from museums is by women artists. And yeah, you can extrapolate the rest from that bit of data visualization there. And worldwide auction sales, which are really just depressing. 3.3% of all worldwide auction sales is work by women artists. Of that, 0.1% is by Black American women artists. And that is of a pot of $176.9 billion spent annually on art at auction. So that's a lot of money that's not going to women artists. In the UK, we've had a similar study that's been going on for the last 10 years or so by the Freelands Foundation, called The Representation of Women Artists in the UK. And about 5 years ago, in 2019, I started talking to Dr. Kate McMillan, who was managing the study at that point, about patterns that weren't really showing up in the data, and kind of factors that weren't really showing up in the data. So there were a few data visualizations that really caught my eye. And two of them are the ones I'm about to show you now. One was the proportion of graduates studying postgraduate courses in art and design. So these are people who are studying with PhD or MA. So these are people that are really serious about having a career as an artist or a designer. And on postgraduate courses in the UK in the art and design faculty, 65%, or let's say 66% of women are non-binary, 34% are male. And you then get to representation by commercial galleries. And what's really fascinating here is that the gender balance completely switches. So 67% of the artists, of living artists represented by commercial galleries, are men, and the remainder are women and non-binary artists. And I was really interested by what was happening between those two career points, between postgraduate studies and getting commercial representation. And it occurred to me that one of the things that generally happens kind of when quite often happens to people when they're in their 30s, which is about when, you know, if you're lucky, you get commercial representation, is that people are starting a family. And I was really interested to know what impact starting a family was having on women and non-binary artists. So I was commissioned by Dr. Kate Macmillan to write an essay looking at the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. And it got a bit out of hand, I must admit. So I ended up doing quite a significant study looking at the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. So I interviewed over 50 artists. They were all based in the UK, but they had roots all over the world. So they had roots everywhere from Guatemala to China. That essay is available in the Freeland Foundation report from 2019. It's available online. You can get hold of it quite easily. But what I wanted to briefly share was some responses, just some quick quotes from some of the artists I spoke to, and that will really lead us into kind of what I've done since. So this is an artist called Rezia Waheed. She's a textile artist, a fiber artist. She does beautiful weavings, and she's standing here with a work called Dancing in the Womb, which is a synesthetic response to her 4 pregnancies. So you can see with each pregnancy, she's got this different sense of color and rhythm that then gets woven into this long piece of cloth. And Rezia said, once people found out that I was pregnant, the distancing started happening. There were no conversations, just a lack of communications and offers. I was seen as not creating work or not being able to create work. When I've told people I was creating and I could participate in exhibitions, I was either seen as lying or telling half-truths. So there's this really interesting phenomenon that was, I think, shared between lots and lots of the artists that I spoke to, that they maybe had established relationships with curators or with institutions or with, universities or education centers. And as soon as people found out that they were pregnant, essentially they stopped contacting them. There was this assumption that they weren't available for work or for making exhibitions. And this whole thing about second guessing a mother or a pregnant person, thinking that they're not a good judge of their own capacity, their own capability, is a pattern that comes up again and again. And I think it's very upsetting. So the fact that Rezia was seen as kind of lying about her capacity to work as an artist is obviously, it's a really horrendous thing to feel. And this is an artist called Echo Morgan, who is a performance artist, and she works a lot with Chinese calligraphy. And she, prior to becoming a parent, she had a very androgynous figure, and she quite often performed nude. And I think giving birth really changed her relationship to her body, and she found it quite difficult to adapt her performances afterwards. That gave her a very different relationship with her body as a performer. And I particularly wanted to cite Echo's experience because it's something I think holds true not only for performance artists, but for performing artists in general. So I've lectured really all around throughout kind of Northwest Europe and a bit in the Eastern United States. And I've quite often had dancers coming to the talks, and they really tell me there's this big taboo around, particularly around the pregnant body on stage in performance. So Echo said, when I first found out I was pregnant, 2 of my international performances got cancelled. Both curators were actually female, but without children. They both emailed me and said, good luck with the family life. If you ever decide to perform again in the future, please keep me informed. So again, this reflected quite a common experience that people have, which is that, again, there were assumptions made about their capacity to participate, that there was a strong taboo that was felt about the pregnant body, particularly the naked pregnant body, on a public platform. But also, sadly, that women are not necessarily always the best allies to other women, and that there was this really strong pattern of older women who'd perhaps really had to struggle against a lot of structural problems to get to the position they were in the art world, who then felt that other younger women needed to go through the same things that they'd had to face themselves. So they shouldn't be an allowance made to them because they were pregnant. And I think also part of this, because I'm not going to go into that, there's a lot of stuff that I normally talk about that because I'm talking about the exhibition, I'm not going to go into today. But one of the big problems that I found throughout the art world is a reluctance to be flexible and to have conversations with people about what they need. So there's a kind of my way or the highway approach that people are coming up against. So, okay, maybe Echo might not have been able to fulfill one of these contracts because she was perhaps going to give birth or she couldn't fly somewhere. but nobody was having a conversation with her going, how about we put your performance next year? Would that suit you? So there wasn't this willingness to be flexible, to delay things, or just to simply have a conversation with people and ask them what they needed, what they wanted, what they thought was appropriate. So this is a wonderful artist called Emma Franks. So she's here in this beautiful flying suit that she stitched, which has got lots of women holding one another up and then flying at the top. But she's actually a really brilliant painter. And I do urge you to check out her work. And she also started a menopausal punk band called Hot Flush. I love this quote from Emma because although it's quite funny, it's also, I think, incredibly true. She says, I don't think society takes artists or mothers seriously, so being an artist and a mother is a double whammy. And that starts to lead me into the territory that I've been exploring a bit more recently, which is that artist mothers aren't necessarily seen as people who are capable of creating exciting avant-garde work. There's a kind of mumsy association. And I think also there is this trope of the mother as a comic trope culturally. You see it in Hollywood films, you see it in stand-up comedy. If you go to any stand-up comedy gig, although I'm sure those of you who've got young children probably haven't been able to do that for a while, but there's always the trope of the mother, the stand-up comedian joking about their mother as being this person that's preoccupied with petty concerns, that's fussy, that's hovering, that's caring too much. And they're not seen as being people that are capable of serious cultural contribution. And I think this has a real impact on the way that art by mothers is read culturally in general. This is the work of a fantastic, again, another fiber artist called Cecile Johnson Solitz. She's from Argentina, actually, and I think her work is really extraordinary. And she actually, she had quite a difficult route as a mother. She had 2 children that she adopted who had quite serious additional care needs. So she had to take quite a long time away from the art world. And she's returned to the art world now, her children a bit more grown up. But she says, my son told me more than once that my art is a hobby. Where in his education has he seen any images or TV programs of mothers who are artists and appreciated for being so? So I think this quote from Cecile again goes back to this point about the artist mother as a cultural figure, that there is no paradigm of the artist mother. There's no visibility. There's not a kind of trope, a popular trope in our culture of the artist mother. We've got the trope of the bohemian artist. We've got the trope of, the artist who's kind of squirreled away in their garret, or who's out there making lots of money in art bars on Miami Beach. But this character of the artist mother doesn't really have visibility. It's not really very present. It's very difficult to kind of point towards, a group of famous people and go, these are the artist mothers, because although they of course exist, they're not necessarily celebrated or very visible in our curricula. This is an amazing abstract painter called Sarah Kogan. I say painter, there's lots of other mystery ingredients going on. And these paintings are very substantial. They're very large, and there's quite a lot of kind of chemical stuff that goes into them. This is a slightly long quote from Sarah, but I thought it bore repeating. She says, I think that female artists are often loath to be seen as the partners of someone or the mother of a child in terms of their careers. There's a sense that we will be diminished as professionals if our relationships with our families become a focus within our visible lives in the art world. The history of art is so steeped in the sexualized perception of women. It's almost as if we are seen through that prism until we become mothers, and then we are seen as domestic objects of little interest. So she's talking really to something that I think maybe women of my generation experience more, which is that you were told very much that if you were going to be an artist, you really couldn't become a mother because you wouldn't be seen as a serious contender. That if you were going to thrive within the art world, you had to make that binary choice, artist or mother. And so in making your identity as a mother public, even today in the contemporary art world, it somehow is seen as diminishing your value somewhat. There is that perception. It is, of course, important to state that it's not just the structural problems within the art world, although there are many that have an impact on artists' careers. This is a set of data visualizations from a fantastic article in The Economist, which I've put the link to if anybody wants to screenshot it. So it's from January of this year, and it's basically an analysis of how motherhood hurts people's careers. So it's looking at, let's say this is like a parity of pay that's happening at the point before a family starts, the birth of the first child. So immediately when you get the birth of the first child, women's earning goes down by 34%, and it doesn't really fully recover 10 years afterwards. So this is what's referred to as the motherhood penalty. It changes country to country, but I looked up the United States, and it looks at the gender pay gap in the United States, and it estimates, but in fact, it probably doesn't estimate, there was probably quite good data analysis that went into this. So it says 3/4 of the gap in the gender pay gap in the US is due to the motherhood penalty. So this, of course, doesn't just impact artists, it impacts, all mothers in the workforce, and single mothers more than anyone else, of course. So if anybody wants to look at that study, there's the link for it there. So having published my essay looking at the impact of motherhood on artists' careers, I then obviously had kind of discovered a lot of issues that were really affecting people badly, and realized that it was very difficult for people to flourish. So there were a few things that I started to think about, because I really wanted to start to address some of these issues. Obviously, you see problems and you want to be part of the solution. So the first thing that I did, having published the essay, was to work with a group of 30 artists on a manifesto called How Not to Exclude Artist Parents. I'm not going to go into this now in detail. It's all available online. It's in 16 different languages. It's open source, so anybody can use it. It's at www.artist-parents.com. The easiest way to find it actually is to go to my website and click on the link, because I think I'm finding that it's not showing up very well at the moment. There's a bit of a flaw with the link, but if you go to my website and click on the link, you can find it. So that's really a 10-point manifesto that's addressed by parents to art institutions and residencies, outlining ways that they can change their practice to become more inclusive. So that's the website. And the next thing that I've really started to do is to address this as not a historical issue. So I'm going to briefly go into a bit of the background on this, because there's obviously this. I'm absolutely not the first person to point this out. I'm not the first person to. I certainly didn't coin the term the mother-shaped hole. But there is an issue with the invisibility of motherhood that really starts, at school, in our art history courses, in our art courses, in the way that artists, that artists taught, and in particular, actually, in the way that feminist artists taught quite often. So quite often when I'm lecturing, doing an art history lecture on this subject, I'll start off with this painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. So I'm sure you all know Artemisia's work, but I think what's interesting is in the kind of girl boss feminism reading of Artemisia, she's seen as a woman wronged. She was a victim of sexual assault. She went through a horrendous experience, going through a trial where essentially her morality was put on trial. And then, her very kind of bloodthirsty Baroque works tend to thereafter be seen as a form of kind of vengeance that's carried out on the canvas. We don't usually talk about Artemisia as being a mother, but she was a mother to 5 children. And this work was painted in 1613, which was the year that she gave birth to her first child. In fact, I think she probably didn't breastfeed. I think she probably had a wet nurse. But this is a Madonna and child that is painted by, I think it's possibly the first Madonna and child painted by somebody that had given birth, like a named artist who'd given birth and had like an experience of what that meant. So this is actually, they think that the model for this is actually the family servant. But so I'm interested in how it changes things when you start to think about Artemisia as an artist mother, and not only as an artist mother, but an artist mother who suffered multiple bereavements. So she lost 4 of her children. And this is something that I go into in my book, which I'll come into at the end of the presentation. There's also, kind of moving into the 20th century, a real kind of image problem. because we have these bohemian artists that are making work, let's say, in the late 19th century with the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists moving through into Surrealism. And there is this association between women artists and the domestic realm. And if the domestic realm is seen, and the mothers and children within it are seen as the domain of women artists, and when women artists were seen as inferior, then by logical extension, this means that they're not subjects for great art. And so as subject matter, women and children in the domestic realm, were kind of seen, were put onto this inferior footing. So quite often women were doing, were associated with flower paintings or paintings of children rather than paintings of noble families. So it's meant that their art was diminished in the eyes of art history, particularly 20th century art historians. So as we move through into the 20th century, we have the Surrealists. So this is André Breton, who was the father of Surrealism, and Jacqueline Lombard, who was his wife. She was also a performance artist. So here she is. She used to do a performance in a tank of water in a kind of artist surrealist cabaret in Paris. She was also a painter. But motherhood was hard to reconcile with bohemian life. I quite often talk about Susan Freeman. So I'm sure lots of you have read Maggie Nelson's fantastic book, The Argonauts. And in The Argonauts, Maggie Nelson uses this phrase, the sodomitical mother. And this came from a book, in fact, by Susan Freeman, where she's picking apart cool and everything that's connected to cool and how we construct cool. And so she talks a lot about the rebel figure and how we constitute the rebel figure as the epitome of cool in the mid-20th century. And of course, the rebel has to rebel against something. So what's he rebelling against? He's rebelling against his mother. So if you've got the rebel at one end and the mother at the other, she says, within this paradigm, the place occupied by the mother is by definition uncool. So this then really leads us right through even into second wave feminism. And there's a real issue, an issue with motherhood in second wave feminism. So this is the amazing Carolee Schneemann. And Carolee Schneemann very much knew that she didn't want to be a mother. This wasn't part of the art career that she had mapped out for herself. And there's this amazing essay that she wrote a bit later in her career called Anti-Demeter, where she remembers being pregnant. And she was pregnant before she was famous, but it was, well, I was going to say before abortion was legalized in the US. But yes, I know, I'm aware this is now a bit anachronistic even to say that now. She went to Cuba, where she obtained an illegal abortion without anesthetic. And her writing about it is quite extraordinary if you're ever interested in looking into it. But she looks back to that time and the experience of being pregnant. And she says, "You are not invited into my body. I did not invite an alien being, a child, into my future. I had a mountainside to climb. Pregnancy was constant pissing and terror, not nausea, but terror. I was taken over. I was no longer an I." So Carolee Schneemann there, who's, was really working before we had this concept of feminist art. And, we now see as this pioneering figure within the feminist art movement, absolutely couldn't countenance the idea of having a child as part of her plan, because to succeed within a heavily sexist art world in which everything was pitched against her was already a mountainside that she was having to climb, and to carry a child with her was more than she felt able to do. And it's been very interesting. I interview a lot of artist mothers of the older generation, and it's quite interesting how a lot of these feminist artists that we see, and I continue to see as real heroes like Judy Chicago, were really problematic in the way that they treated them. I'll come on to mother art in a bit, and I'm sure you all know mother art very well, but Judy Chicago is absolutely one of the people in the women's building who was saying to them, you can't be both an artist and a mother. And there are other artists in my exhibition that have had that conversation with Judy Chicago, and they've kind of said, well, what if I just have one kid? She's like, well, maybe one's okay. But, so there's these kind of feminist foremothers that we have within the art world absolutely didn't see motherhood as being a part of the plan. And it's been really reflected in the way that feminist art histories have been written. And very often artists who are making work about motherhood in the domestic realm have been excluded from those art histories, basically with the exception of Mary Kelly's postpartum document. So for all of these reasons, I thought it was very important to start looking at an art history of motherhood, and to start to think about the works that are being overlooked and ignored, and also at the way that motherhood has been addressed as a subject art historically. So that really since 2020 has been my kind of larger project that I've been looking into. And it's taken me until this year for the exhibition to actually happen, partly for reasons of COVID and partly, I have to say, because the subject was not seen as being a particularly interesting one by a lot of organizations. So I should say that I did also write a book about motherhood in the art world and the structural issues, and lots of people who are doing things to remedy some of the structural issues, among them Kaylin. Kaylin definitely crops up in here. So thank you very much, Kaylin, for allowing me to write about your work. And I think some of you may know that book already. And before we get on to the exhibition, I just also wanted to mention an organization that I co-founded with Joe Harrison in 2022 called the Art Working Parents Alliance. And part of the reason that I founded the Art Working Parents Alliance is because while I was doing all of this work on artist mothers, I was being contacted by people elsewhere in the art world. So they were curators, academics, educators, gallerists, you know, all over the place, basically saying, you know what, things are really difficult for us as well. And we feel very structurally excluded and we are invisible to one another. And, you know, we need some help. And so we founded the Art Working Parents Alliance for everyone working in the art world and for parents explicitly, not just mothers. So it's a support network and campaigning organization acknowledging the unpaid labor of parenthood done by those working in the art world. It is just UK based because some of the things that we're doing are really talking about specific issues in the UK, and they'll be to do with employment law and the way that universities are run and art schools are run over there. We really invite people to create sibling networks. So I think we've got one in Germany and one in South Africa already. I run it with Joe on a completely voluntary basis. There's no barrier to entry. So the whole thing's unpaid, unfunded, sadly, and quite a lot of unpaid labor. But you know, that's unfortunately this is the way things run. It's all parents working in the art world, curators, gallerists, academics, educators, technicians, and more. We offer a monthly newsletter, in-person and online meetups, regional and sector-based WhatsApp groups, and mentorship pairings. You can join as an observer if you're outside the UK, but the WhatsApp groups and meetups are local within the UK. Part of the reason we have these groups is to make people visible to one another, but also it can just be also a kind of like a social network, because quite often people in the art world feel very isolated when they become parents. So it allows people to connect and also to ask one another advice. So if you're having to negotiate maternity or parental leave within your organization, and it's a small organization that has no experience of that, you can ask people, you know, about their experiences and that kind of thing. So you're also welcome to start your own local alliance, although I'm aware you have the wonderful Thrive Together network. If you want to find out more, that's at our free, because we have no money, WordPress website, artworkingparents.wordpress.com. And I just wanted to share this little meme that I made recently, which is another reason why it seemed important to do a lot of this work alongside making the exhibition, because the art world is not very keen on giving support to parents and other caregivers, but they love an exhibition about care. So that comes on to the exhibition. So it was a very long preamble, but I promise I will leave space at the end. So the exhibition is a Hayward Gallery touring exhibition. Kaylin asked me a little bit to talk about how I set it up. And actually, I can't give amazing insight into this because this whole project really started by me thinking in terms of a book. And then when publishers nixed the idea of a book because they thought that it was a very niche idea and that nobody would be interested, I talked to Hayward Gallery Touring, which is the UK's national touring organization. I think you have something similar in the US with I think you probably have a US, like an American national touring organization, which supplies exhibitions to regional galleries around the UK. And they invited me to propose an exhibition, which I did. And they then put it out to their various partners around the UK. So we now have a touring exhibition, which started in Bristol. It then moves to Birmingham, which is the UK's second city, and then to Sheffield, and then it finishes up in Scotland, in Dundee. I have had some interest from European organizations and like a bit from the USA. So there's potential to do, I think, a version of this show elsewhere if there is interest to do it, but nothing concrete happening at the moment. So the exhibition is divided into 4 principal sections. So I'm going to kind of whistle through the sections, giving you a little bit of a view into the work that's in them. I should say it's a really large exhibition. So there are 70 artists in the exhibition. There are substantially over 100 artworks. So this is a really tight sprint. But the show starts with a section called Creation, which looks at conception, pregnancy, and nursing. And really one of the things that was very important in the exhibition was to acknowledge the fact that conception doesn't come easily to many people. So the work on the left is by Wangechi Muta. It's not a very good view of it, actually, but it's from a series called Fertility Heals. And she makes them around armatures of like platform high-heeled shoes, and it kind of looks like a uterus, but it's got Kenyan red clay put all over it. And then the version that we have in the exhibition actually has cow's horns coming out of it, and then Rhus natalensis wood, which is a kind of sacred wood, and various other kind of substances that you might associate with alternative healing practices. And I wanted to start with this because it really points to the fact that women's bodies are often very ill served by the medical profession. There's a lot of misdiagnosis, particularly for women of color, particularly around fertility issues. And about 50% of people that experience that really kind of struggle to conceive turn to alternative remedies. They look beyond mainstream medicine because they really don't feel understood, and in particular women of color. The work on the right is by another artist based in New York called Leah Satera. It's called You Can't Have It All, and it's a beautiful kind of small blown glass hourglass that obviously looks like a uterus and fallopian tubes. And this really talks to that kind of thing of obviously the kind of cliche of the biological clock, which is used as a kind of, almost as a kind of weapon to wallop women with, but also this feeling of, how much can you fit into your life? How much time do you have to focus on your career? How can you fit children in around that? And all the different kinds of juggling that goes on, but also the way that this idea of the biological clock is really being kind of instrumentalized at the moment. And when women are very much, this kind of idea of kind of hacking your fertility is being promoted to women, and this idea of kind of egg freezing is really being promoted to people, not necessarily in a very ethical way. So Leah's very interested in looking at the body in terms of technology and how they're spoken about in the same terms. The work. So I also have a lot of historic works in this section, some of which are really too big to show on a slideshow. So we've got Susan Hiller's classic work, 10 Months. This work on the left is by a German artist called Annegret Soltau, who's a German artist. And this was a really very scandalous set of works that was made at the time, partly because she was using her own naked body in them, but also she's really talking very strongly about maternal ambivalence. And so she was really in the 1970s hitting up a number of taboos that made these works pretty scandalous in Germany when she was showing them at the time. So she uses black thread a lot in her work. So she uses it in performance works where she wraps it around herself, but she also stitches it into photographs so that it's like surgical sutures. So it's making this kind of link between embroidery as a kind of women's tradition and surgery. And this beautiful pastel work on the right is by Claudette Johnson, who I'm excited to say at the age of 60-something has just been nominated for the Turner Prize yesterday. So the Turner Prize is Britain's most important prize for contemporary art. And she in her 60s is a nominee this year, which is just absolutely extraordinary. So she is somebody that really took a long time out of her career to look after her children. So this work was made in 1990 and it's called Afterbirth. And she's looking at her body and the changes to her body after becoming a parent. And I love the way that her stretch marks are it's like she's written on her own body. It's like a kind of inscription in this wandering line that's gone into her body. So the second half of Creation looks at nursing. We've got a big body of work by Camille Rowe on the left, which is looking at this kind of contemporary mother as a cyborg figure. So that, this figure that's also, that's plugged into machines and is having to express milk. And she also plays with words and language a lot. So she's thinking about the way we talk about expressing milk and self-expression. And then as a polyglot artist, also the mother tongue and how the process of feeding passes the mother tongue onto the baby. The work on the right is from the 80s, and it's by an artist called Catherine Elwes, and it's one of the many works in the show that's been censored pretty much throughout its existence. And for that reason, despite being, I think, a really important feminist video work, it's almost unknown. Very little shown, because it, of course, shows a female breast expressing milk rather than, there to provide sexual pleasure. So the main focus of the work really is on this her breast and this baby hand, which actually looks like it's being quite violent towards it. And anyone who's breastfed a child will kind of recognize that thing, that actually what you can't see is that she's breastfeeding the baby on the other side, and meanwhile the baby's hitting her other nipple and milk starts to flow out of it. But it actually looks like the baby's agitating her for milk. So it's got this, again, this quite strong sense of ambivalence going on, and this kind of slightly monstrous relationship between the mother and the baby. The second section is called Maintenance, and it's named in honor, of course, of Mila Latimer-Nikilis's famous Maintenance Art Manifesto. And I should say I've used color very strongly throughout the exhibition, and the colors are a lot subtler, the ones I've used in the background, but it does roughly accord with the color of paint that I've used in the background. So the Maintenance opens with these two works, and on the left we have Valley Export's The Birth Madonna, which was made in the 1970s. And this is a really fascinating work, because I don't know if any of you know Valley Export's work, but she's really known as a kind of punk. So she did this famous work that's called Action Pants, Genital Panic, where she was performing in a pair of jeans with a crotch cut out of them, carrying what looked like a machine gun, and she walked along the aisles of an art cinema in Vienna with her exposed crotch at the viewer's face height, and people just slowly left the cinema. And this work really is her thinking about the conservative culture in Vienna, which was where she was living at the time, and how there was this transition from the extremely strict conservative Catholicism into this new post-war identity where the mother was expected to be the ultimate consumer. And of course, this really reflects Betty Friedan's work in The Feminine Mystique. But in Europe post-war, we obviously had we were in an economic crisis after the war. So that whole idea of consumer goods really started to come through much later in the century. So she's got here, a washing machine from a washing machine advertisement. And on top of it, she's got Botticelli's Madonna in the position of the Pieta. And then underneath, you've got the bloodied sheet, either from birth or from the dead body of Christ coming out below. So it's this idea that your choice as a mother was either to be the Madonna or to be the ultimate consumer. On the other side, we've got another quite early work by a British artist called Flick Allen. And she made this actually the year before she became a mother. And she was the first generation of women who had access to the birth control pill. And it's really thinking about this work's absolutely enormous. Like, it's about 3 meters high. And it's really thinking about the baby as this kind of monstrous thing that's hanging over you. Even if you haven't become a mother, you've always got the presence of this monstrous child that you're not quite sure you want to have yet hanging over you. We've got classic work by Sally Mann from the which I'm sure you all know. This is Emmett's Bloody Nose. And then on the left, this is an amazing, it's a cinematic scale photograph by Hannah Starkey, where she's thinking about the mother as hero, how to portray the mother as a heroic figure. And I mentioned Susan Freeman earlier and her talking about the construction of cool in the mid-century. And a lot of you will recognize this pose being one that was adopted from East of Eden and Badlands, of the kind of like that rebel hero with his arms over a gun, basically with his arms. So this was really taken on the way back from dropping her children at nursery school. So she and the woman in the photograph, Kim, had just been to primary school. They dropped their kids off. They went out onto the green that's near their house in Hackney, and they set this photograph up. We also have a few works that are about the limits of maternal care, like the stage at which you can no longer, you feel like you can no longer protect your child. So I wanted to include this because it's got, of course, a work by Kaylin's great friend Cassie Arnold on on the right-hand side here. So you've got Bulletproof Dress, which we've had shipped over, which is it's going down amazingly well in Bristol. And on the other side, on the left, this is an extraordinary series of drawings by Barbara Walker, who was in fact nominated for the Turner Prize last year. And it's a series of drawings that were done on arrest dockets by the police that she found in her son's drawer. So she's thinking about her son as a young Black man in Birmingham, and the fact that he's being watched on CCTV, and that, you know, her darling teenage son is being seen by some people as a potential criminal, and that he's constantly being picked up by what we in the UK call stop and search. There's a section within maintenance that's called the kitchen, which is dedicated to the idea of the kitchen table as a site of culture, a site of making. So we've got Mill Ladham and Eucalyptus's Maintenance Art Manifesto. We've got works by Mother Art. So they're all shown in facsimile and they're pasted to the wall in a kind of DIY punk style. So this is this work by Mother Art is from their Laundry Work series. I'm sure you're all very well acquainted with Mother Art's work. And we've also got various other feminist groups from around the world. So on the left here is Feministo from the UK. And on the right, there's a fantastic group from Mexico City called Polvo de Gallina Negra. And they're here on a talk show in Mexico in the 1980s with a very popular talk show host. And they've decreed him to be Mother of the Day. They've given him a pregnancy apron. They're dosing him for morning sickness. And this was a fantastic kind of live performance that happened on Mexican television, which again caused a bit of a scandal over there and was seen as being very demeaning for Guillermo Ochoa, who participated. And we finish up with a section called Loss, which is looking at maternal grief, but that also includes grief for the child that didn't happen. And again, I'm sure this body of work is very familiar to you. It's a long series of photographs by Elena Brotheros called Annunciation. So we've got a whole series of these that are shown on a shelf along one wall. And they chart her experience of going through IVF. And the photographs are shown above diary pages over the course of 5 years, which register her cycle. And it's called Annunciation in reference to the Annunciation of the Virgin, which is that moment which is so popular in Renaissance art when the Virgin Mary is visited by the angel Gabriel, who tells her that she's carrying a child. And so this is the Annunciation. It's called Annunciation, but she pictures herself quite often waiting, that she's waiting for the angel that never comes. We also look at obstetric violence and also the experience of disabled women. So the work on the left is by an artist called Nancy Willis, who uses a wheelchair, and she was told when she was very young that she would die as a very young woman. So when she became pregnant at art school, she went and asked for an abortion, and the doctor said, well, why don't you have a sterilization? Which she agreed to, thinking that she'd never lived long enough to have a child. And then a couple of years later, her prognosis was changed. And she was told that she would live a full life, but it was too late then to have the sterilization reversed. So this is a work where she's thinking about the baby that she was unable to have. And on the right, we have a work by Tracy Emin, which relates to a very large body of work that she's made about her experience of obstetric violence and having a botched abortion. So it's called Something's Wrong. And in fact, this is a huge work. It's the size of a blanket. And what you can see coming out of her, they're actually coins. And they're a mixture of Greek and British coins. And so she's got mixed Greek and British parentage. So I think it's expressing, this is a kind of like her lifeblood and her heritage kind of flowing out of her and kind of, you know, going nowhere. And it ends up with a series of works that are also looking at reproductive rights and the protest for reproductive rights. So on the left, we have a work from a very famous series by Paula Rego, which she made in Portugal ahead of a referendum on abortion. And on the right, a body of work by Rachel Fallon that was made ahead of the recent Irish referendum on abortion. And these are called The Aprons of Power, and she's made quite a few of them in solidarity with women in other countries. So there's quite an ongoing series of these works. Sorry, I'm running quite over time, so I'll race a bit. But in the middle, in the middle of the exhibition, we have a gallery which is called the Temple, which is given over to self-portraits. So this goes back to the idea that I was talking about at the beginning of the idea that the artist mother as a paradigm isn't culturally visible. And so this is making her visible. This is presenting the artist in self-portraiture, identifying herself either as a mother or in relation to mother in some way. So I'm sure you know both of these works. They're very famous. We've got Renee Cox on the left and Kathy Opie on the right. And I painted the walls of the temple ultramarine, which is a reference to the Virgin Mary's cloak in Renaissance art. So we're taking the Virgin as being the kind of historic paradigm of the mother in art and presenting counter images in a way. On the left, this is a work by Ishbel Meyerskoff called All, which is looking at the younger generation, pushing the older generation out of the way. So her poor husband Cormac there is being cropped out. And this is a wonderful work by Billy Zangawa on the right. It's a silk applique. And it's called Every Woman. So here she is being every woman, picking up the toys on the way out to work in the morning. And just two final works here. This is a beautiful portrait, a self-portrait with her son Frank by Celia Paul, who in the UK she's a very respected senior artist. And this is about the shifting relationship between a mother and her son as he gets older. So she never did a self-portrait with him when he was young because she felt the power dynamic would be off. He's now left home, he's been to university, he's come back, and she's now doing one with him when he's in his 20s. And I love this shift in the relationship between mother and child that's happening here, and the kind of smile that's being exchanged between them. And then on the right, we have a beautiful work by Jessa Fairbrother called Role Play Women with Cushion. And in it, she's based her pose on a photograph she found of her mother when her mother was pregnant. And she made this after her mother died. And after she had been through many rounds of IVF and basically came to accept that she would not be a birthing body. And she's here doing this role play with a cushion, and you've got it pierced with gold. And the gold is like the spirit of the child that she imagines passing through and holding inside her body and then leaking back out again as each cycle goes through. So these are the tour dates of the exhibition. I'm afraid they are all in the UK currently. If you would like a version of the exhibition to come to the US, yeah, talk to curators in your circle. But all of this and more will be explored in my book, which is coming out this summer. It comes out in the US on the 3rd of September, and I will be coming to the States to launch it. I'm coming definitely to New York. I don't know where else currently, but I will be around talking about my book. So it's got a much broader art historical stretch, and so it goes back about 500 years, but it also has a much broader geographical scope than the exhibition is able to. And at that point, sorry, I've gone on too long. We've got time for some questions. So I'll stop screen sharing. And I'll go on to a grid view, but I think if you've got a question, maybe hit the kind of hand thing and it maybe allows me to see more easily.
Hettie, thank you so much. I'll start with a question just to kick us off. I have a couple. First, when did you say the book is releasing?
3rd of September in the US. So it's out in July in the UK and 3rd of September in the US.
And is it like exhibition catalog plus like essays and writing, or like?
It's a proper book. So it's a standalone book. So although it covers much of the same structure that I went over with the exhibition, it's
Are
much
there
more.
images of artwork included in the book?
Sorry?
Are there images of artwork in the book?
Yes, there are 150 images in the book.
Amazing. Another just logistical question about the show, is there currently like a place where all of the 70 artists are listed? Like, to find out more about the show and the artists included, where would people who won't be able to fly to the UK to see it, where would they be able to like kind of get a comprehensive list?
I think probably currently it's at the Arnolfini, so the Arnolfini should have an updated list on their website. So
Okay.
I don't know if you know the Van Eyck painting, the Arnolfini Wedding, which is the one where there's the famous convex mirror in the background with him reflecting. The art centre is named after that painting, so it's at the Arnolfini Centre in Bristol.
Amazing. And then I had a question just like related to the process of curation. I love the thoughtful way in which you structured this very like diverse experience and expression of the show, right? I think one of sort of the tropes of artist motherhood or artists making work about motherhood is that the narrative is kind of all the same, right? And so to me, diversity of expressions of care are very much something that I'm always like thinking about, and how can we kind of, and clearly something that you've really thought of. So just curious for you, like, because what I've found is that when I, like, the deeper I dig, right, the more is revealed. And sometimes actually the diversity in these experiences is quite overwhelming. So knowing that as somebody who's like done, you know, a lot of thinking about this, just curious, like what you kind of used as sort of guideposts, like those, the ways that you structured the show, like did that lead you, like you were kind of like, I'm going to pick these themes and then like look for works that fit within the themes? Or was it more based on like your own experience of motherhood, or your own, like, kind of, what are some of the ways in which you as a curator wanted to craft the show as a whole and make sure that it was diverse, but also that there was some cohesion, you know?
So, I mean, I've obviously done a huge amount of kind of research and critical, like a critical reading around the subject. So it was a blend of things of being led by works that I knew I wanted, but also of subjects that I wanted to hit. It absolutely is not uh, autobiographical, I would say, in any way, pretty much. My kids are in their 20s at this point, but also I'm really aware that my experience is very atypical. You know, like in fact, there isn't a typical experience, but if I was just going to base it on my experience, I think that would have been a very boring exhibition. So part of what I really wanted to do with the show was to honor the work of previous generations of artists, because they haven't, like, a proper art history of their work hasn't been written. And I feel like when I see the work quite often of contemporary artists, I feel that they're almost making the same works over and over again, because the art history has not been written. And this is in fact something that Judy Chicago says, which is, until we write our history, we're condemned to repeat it over and over again. So I wanted to draw people's attention to important works that are not canonical works, but I think potentially deserve to be canonical works within this field. So I kind of tended to default to the work that was earliest to approach a particular subject. And then there are certain works that actually were approaching subjects that I felt, that were very, very recent works that were approaching subjects in new ways. So sometimes it was simply the strength of the work. Sometimes there were, I knew that I wanted to have this kind of flow, but I was also using language in the way that I title sections of the work, which also were kind of puns with language that we use in the art world anyway. So of course, we talk about creation, self-expression, and all of this kind of thing. So there's a bit of kind of art historical punning going on as well in that way.
Another question just related to research, and folks, feel free to put questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature. You kind of touched on the idea of using research to create and curate the show, but then having to, it's like, what is the source material for that research? Where is the, like, that rewriting that needs to happen? I love the way that you framed the Artemisia, like kind of the reframing of that. So just thinking of how also when you're doing the work of trying to rewrite the history, oftentimes in researching, that becomes the immediate stumbling block because there's just not a lot of content there, right? So like, how did you kind of approach researching the work in ways that you felt like were not just sources from white men or gatekeepers in the art world?
I mean, there is a lot of fantastic feminist art historical research, and some of it was really obscure, and I had to track down really obscure texts. But there's like an amazing, like there's an amazing text that's looking at kind of whether Baroque women artists used wet nurses and stuff. I mean, like, they're quite obscure subjects. They're not going to be, they're not going to be kind of like stuff that's available in the local Barnes and Noble. But I mean, it's and it's been kind of, I guess it's been 4 or 5 years of research as well. But I mean, I'm absolutely treading in the footsteps of 50 years of really amazing feminist art history and feminist art historians have come before me. So, I am lucky there was that work. But then some of it is also just my knowledge. So I'm very lucky that I spend most of my time in museums, going around museums and looking at things and looking at representation. So I also can base it on my own research to a greater or lesser extent. I think Michelle's got her hand up there. Michelle, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you. This is really interesting. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm always surprised when when I learn artists are mothers that I didn't realize who don't deal with motherhood. Recently, like Rachel White-Reed, I realized is a mother, but she doesn't really deal with it in her work. Did you have anybody who didn't want to participate in the show because they didn't want to be associated with motherhood? Or have we, I hope so, moved past that kind of stigma?
Well, I mean, kind of by default, everybody that was in the show was dealing with motherhood as a subject. So that wasn't an issue. I have to say that when I did the book, or with the original study, there were a lot of people who participated in the study who didn't want their name shared.
Interesting.
And it was then really interesting that once the study came out and there was quite a strong reaction to the study.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of them got in touch and said, actually, when you do the book, I'm happy for you to use my name now. So there was really a sense that the perception was shifting.
Must
Yeah.
have felt good.
Yeah. So I mean, there are absolutely, there are loads and loads of artists who are mothers who don't make work about mother. But I think if you're making work about motherhood, you've kind of outed yourself at that point.
Thanks.
I think that was a question in the chat.
Yeah, I'll read it for you. Also, I'm sorry, Brooke, I missed your question. Is there a pre-sale for the book?
I think it's probably up on Amazon already. It's going to be a holding image of the cover. It's not the proper cover, but yes.
Bonnie's question, in terms of the pushback or disinterest on the subject, do you feel like it's slowly getting better? I'm also wondering if you have seen Clarity Haynes' recent show called Portals of Large Monumental Paintings of Crowning. I feel
yes. Yeah, I mean, I've not seen the actual show, but I know the work. It's really hard to know because I'm absolutely in the kind of artist mother world bubble. So it's quite difficult to gauge stuff from outside. I would say that it took me a really long time to get a publisher for the book, and Thames and Hudson didn't sign on until basically like June last year, and I didn't get a contract until like well after I mean, it was like they couldn't have seemed less interested and less invested in it. And it's been really abundantly clear throughout the time I've been working on it with them that it's incredibly low priority for them. So it's constantly being put on the back burner. So they clearly don't think this is a massively significant book. I'd really like to prove them wrong, but so the exhibition opened in March and the book's not coming out until July. That shows you how low priority it is for them. So the fact that they've not actually managed to produce it to function alongside the exhibition, it's completely bonkers the fact they've done that. But it's been like pulling teeth all the way through trying to get this book produced. So I think the idea that this is going to in any way be a significant book for Thames and Hudson is not something they're countenancing right now. Obviously, if this it would be great if it did become a significant book. Let's all try and make it one. But yeah, it's definitely still seen as pretty marginal, I think.
All right, and we'll wrap up with Anna Kavina's question. Hi, Hettie. Thank you so much for speaking to our community today. I'm wondering if you could speak more to the concept of, quote, artist mother as a cultural figure. I mention it to my children, much to their puzzlement. I am especially thinking of goal setting. What are we aiming for looking forward? Perhaps parallels to some established historical examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that, I mean, I think it goes back to that point that I was making with Emma Franks's thing about saying that artists, that mothers aren't taken seriously anyway. And the idea that, you know, trying to shift the thing so that a mother isn't just seen as a comic trope, that they're also seen as somebody that's capable of making a really important cultural contribution as well. And I think that's what we all need to work towards shifting. But I think to start to talk more about, you know, artists historically who had children, I think it will help. And I think, you know, all of these gestures, whether it's the, you know, your podcast or the work that, you know, all kinds of, I know Shweta's involved in all kinds of things. You know, it all contributes towards it as well, and all the visibility in the conversations. But one of the questions I ask quite a lot in you know, when I do symposiums and things, is how we get this conversation out of the bubble. You know, because there really is a bubble that you know, there are lots of these conversations going on, but it's among you know, it's among kind of people that have got a dog in the fight, shall we say, and to get it to make people who are in the wider art world kind of start to talk about this, I think is also really significant.
Okay, one more question as we wrap up, Hettie. For many reasons, I feel like so many of your references I'm unaware of, and I've read Linda Nocklin's essay, Why Are There No Female Artists? I've been struggling to educate myself and wondering if there was a book on art, feminism, or artist mother that has been published as a must read, what would it be?
Well, it comes out on the 3rd of September, obviously. I mean, there are so many great, I mean, there's a kind of, that's the thing. I mean, there are lots of like great feminist art histories that I don't think were particularly brilliant in terms of books on motherhood. So I mean, there's the classic Griselda Pollock and Rosica Parker Great Mistresses book, which came out in 1980 now. So it's quite old, but
Mother is The Mother Not. Have you read that by Jane Lazaire? A lot of people reference Anne Truitt's Day book, which in my opinion is not that much about motherhood, but it's more about kind of, you know, the journal, like a daily journal of an artist, and motherhood is sprinkled in.
Yeah, I mean, there are other books in general. What I quite often found is that the books about motherhood were quite academic.
Mhm.
Yeah, somebody's mentioned, Shweta mentioned Baby on Fire Escape. Baby on Fire Escape is great. It's obviously not just about artists, it's about writers and creativity in general. So there are quite a few books that are about motherhood, but they tend to be quite academic in the way they're written, and they're not kind of like accessible, mainstream, color illustrated kind of like, you know, books. So I wanted to write something that was a much more accessible book. So there has been really good and important writing by all kinds of people, and I've got 3 shelves of them behind me. But and there is an enormous bibliography in my book, which will give you huge pointers to everything else as well. In fact, there's quite a significant bibliography in And Not to Exclude as well.
Yes, and Artist Parent Index has a list. Artist Mother, I think we have like a hidden page with a list that I have probably need to update. You know, it's like on top of all the other things, Hettie, give us a resource list. But you wrote a book and it's in there. So thank you. Okay, friends, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Hettie, for your time and just the amazing work that you're doing. What a great presentation. And this, of course, will be recorded so you can go back and look at all the artists. I was jotting down names and I was like, duh, Kaylin, you're recording this for yourself too. So, because there's lots of artists that you mentioned that I want to be able to go back and dig into. So thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Hettie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Yes,
Thank you.
we'll try to get you a show here in the US. Come on, let's get our connection.
Hey, oh no, wait, no, well, the thing I wanted to say is I'm going to be in Bloomington in 2 weeks, and I don't know if anybody knows anybody in Bloomington, but I'd love to do a talk while I'm in Bloomington because I'm studying at the Kinsey Institute between the 9th and the 18th of May. If anybody knows anybody in Bloomington that might like to do a talk or a workshop or something, tell them to, or might like me to do a talk or a workshop, I can tell them to get in touch.
I don't see anybody on the call who's from Indiana except for me, but I'm going to connect you. So, all right. Bye, friends. Have a great day. Thank you.